Before we go out into the field and learn how to shoot long exposures with an ND filter, I just want to quickly talk to you about what an ND filter is. Essentially, when we take a shot, usually we open up our shutter, the light hits the sensor, and then we close the shutter. But an ND filter partially blocks the light, so it takes a lot longer for enough light to get through and hit your sensor and create a well-exposed shot. So the great thing is, in order to get enough light through, we have to open up our shutter for longer periods of time. And during that time, we can capture fantastic movement in clouds and water. And sometimes if we have tourists in our shot, we can use long exposures to make them invisible as they move around. So these can make a huge difference to our photos. Now there are different types of ND filters. There's the ND filter that we have here, which we can just slot into a filter holder, or there's a screw-on ND filter and you screw it onto the end of your lens. So you have to find the right size for your lens in both situations. Now my screw-on I quite enjoy. It's a little bit awkward to put on, but it's a B&W 77 10 stop and it creates a nice warm cast. This is a Nisi 10 stop and I really like Nisi filters. They're my favorite. They are basically without a color cast, which is very rare for ND filters. And you have to get the Nisi filter holder too. The great thing about using these types of filters is that essentially they have a number of slots so I can stack filters. So I've got a 10 stop here, I can put that in, and if I want an even longer exposure, I've got a 6 stop also by Nisi, which I can put into the filter holder too, and that will give us an even longer exposure. Now, the other thing that we need that will be very useful is a calculator, a long exposure calculator, and this is the one that I have on my smartphone. Now, I got this for free, so it's currently free for most phones, but if you can't find that one or if they're starting to charge for it, there will be other long exposure calculators out there for you. Now, a long exposure calculator isn't necessarily essential, but it just makes it a lot easier to work out your shutter speeds. And I'm going to show you how to do that out in the field anyway. There's another type of ND filter that people use called a graduated ND filter or a GND. Now, I don't use that in my photography just because I exposure blend. But if you're curious to find out what a GND is, you can Google it and there's lots of information out there. But if you're going to be exposure blending, then you don't need a graduated neutral density filter. It's not necessary. So with all that in mind, it's time to go out into the field and look at how to shoot long exposures. To shoot long exposures, the first thing we need to do is set up our camera and tripod just as we normally would. Now, I've already put my filter holder on my lens just so I can very quickly put my filter on when I'm ready. I've also, on my viewfinder here, I have a little latch and that allows me to close up my viewfinder because when we shoot long exposures, sometimes light leaks through the viewfinder, hits the sensor and causes light bleeding. Now, if you haven't got a little latch here to close your viewfinder, you can put a little bit of black tape on there and that'll do the same thing. Now, we want to make the tripod nice and sturdy, so we open up the legs as wide as we possibly can. I've got some little spikes at the bottom of my tripod and I unscrew those and make them longer and I can dig them into the ground. They're not essential, but they are quite useful. Now, it's best not to push the central column all the way up to the top because that'll make the tripod much more unsteady, unstable. Also, at the bottom of my central column, I have a little hook here, and I can hang my bag or something heavy from that hook, and it adds extra stability to the camera and the tripod. Now that we've set up our hardware, we need to compose our shot as we normally would through the live view rather than the viewfinder because that's all blocked up now. We need to manually focus, so I'm going to focus on the tallest part of that cliff in front of us. I've got my camera set to manual mode and we've already looked at how to manually bracket, so we're going to use those skills now. I've chose the optimal settings for my camera and lens, which is f8 and ISO of 100, and now I'm going to work with the shutter speed. So I'm going to choose the dial that controls the shutter speed and I'm going to bring down the shutter speed until the exposure indicator says that we're at a 0 exposure or our base exposure. Now I want to expose for the water here, so this is where hopefully we'll get some nice smooth surfaces. Now it says, my manual mode says that I need a shutter speed of a 60th of a second to get a normal exposure. So I'm going to quickly test that. And looking through my live view, I'd say that's a little bit too bright. So I'm gonna go down a stop, and now I'm at 125th of a second. And I'll try that. And that's a lot better. So 125th of a second is my shutter speed right now. So now that we know our shutter speed, we need to calculate what our shutter speed will be to get the same exposure using our ND filter. Now I'm using a 10-stop ND filter, so we can leave our shutter open a little bit longer and get some of those smoother textures. Now, I'm gonna open up my app. So in the app, we've got ND 10-stop selected, and we're choosing 125th of a second. And this says we need to keep our shutter open for 8 seconds in order to come out with the same exposure as the exposure we just saw. So let's see if that works. I'm going to put my 10 stop on here and I'm going to test it, and we'll see what it looks like. So now I've put my 10 stop filter on. The next thing we need to do is actually change our shutter speed, because before it was set at 125th of a second. So now we need to put it along to 8 seconds, because that's what the calculator said we needed to come out with that base exposure. I've done that now, so I'm going to take a shot and see what happens. Okay, the camera's just finished. So if we look in live view, we can see if that's nicely exposed for, and indeed it is. And we get some nice soft water in the foreground. So as you can see, using an ND filter really isn't very difficult. The formula is set your aperture and ISO to whatever you need it to be, and then manually change your shutter speed until you choose the correct exposure. Test it, and then take your shutter speed from the camera and use the calculator to calculate your ND filter speed. Put your ND filter on and fire away. And that's it. But what about scenes that are more difficult? Scenes where we have less light and we want to do longer exposures, over 30 seconds or a couple of minutes. Well, in this particular scene, it's not going to happen. Not with a 10 stop, because there's just so much light to work with that we just can't block that much light out with a 10 stop ND filter. The good news is there are stronger filters out there, or we can stack filters. Now I've got a 10 stop ND filter and a 6 stop. Combined, that's 16 stops. And we can do exactly what we've done before and still come out with a longer exposure. For example, previously we worked with 125th of a second. Now I'm going to use the calculator again, and I'm going to work out how long we need our shutter speed to be if we use a 16 stop ND filter. So I've got my calculator here. I've chosen 16 stops. I've got a base shutter speed of 125th of a second, but my actual shutter speed with a 16 stop ND filter is 8 minutes and 44 seconds, which is far too long. We just want maybe 2 minutes here. So this is where we have to start using slightly more advanced camera skills. We have to change aperture and ISO so that we can have a quicker shutter speed, which we've already done before. And as we already know, a larger aperture or a smaller f-stop is a quicker shutter speed, and a higher ISO adds to a quicker shutter speed as well. So I'm going to change my aperture to around 6.3, which is still quite sharp for this lens. In fact, it's very sharp for this particular lens. And I'm going to bring my ISO up to about 400. Now I'm playing with my shutter speed, and at the moment it says 640th of a second for a base exposure. So I'm going to test that very quickly and have a look at the live preview, and that again is a little bit overexposed, just like it was last time, so I need to bring it down a little bit more. And now it's 1250th of a second. So let's see what the ND calculator says about that. So with the calculator, I'm just going to scroll along until I'm at, I forgot what that was, 1250th of the second, and that says the shutter speed needs to be 52 seconds. So that's not quite enough. So I'm gonna instead bring my aperture up again to 7.1. In fact, I'm gonna bring it up to 8. and that gives us a shutter speed of 800th of a second. So now we've got an aperture of f8 and we've got ISO of 400. So let's change the shutter speed to 800th of a second, and that's 1 minute and 21. Well, we want to try and get to 2 minutes. So I can change my ISO down to 250, and now that gives us a shutter speed of 500th of a second. So let's have a look at 500th of a second, and that's 2 minutes and 11 seconds. So I'm going to put my 10 stop and my 6 stop on at the same time, and I'm going to leave the shutter open for 2 minutes and 11 seconds, and we'll see what it looks like. So both of my filters are on. Now I need to switch to bulb mode in order to shoot anything above 30 seconds. So I'm still in manual mode on a Nikon, and I'm just going to scroll along all the way to the end, and there we see bulb mode after 30 seconds. Now I have my remote in bulb mode, and I just set it off, and I'm going to leave it open for 2 minutes and 11 seconds, and we'll see what happens. Okay, so that's 2 minutes and 11 seconds over and done with. Let's have a look at the image, and we've got a really nicely exposed for scene with gorgeous soft water. That's perfect for this particular scene, to get that nice glassy smooth water. So as you can see, even when we stack exposures, if we follow that same basic principle using the calculator with the shutter speed that we see in our manual dial, we can pretty much get it right every single time. Now, there are a lot of photographers out there who like long exposure effects but don't do it themselves because they feel like it's a little bit too risky. You know, when it's a beautiful golden hour shot and the light's fading, sometimes it can take 2 or 3 minutes to shoot a particular exposure. And if it goes wrong, if we make a mistake, then we've lost that light. However, if you follow these principles, it really isn't too difficult. Sometimes, however, for shooting it, for example, sunset, and the light is fading, I recommend, if it's a 2 minute exposure and you're exposing for the sky, just to add an extra minute on there. Because we're losing a little bit of light over that time, the scene's getting a bit darker, so that's just to compensate for that loss of light.